The Philadelphia Naval Shipyard hummed with activity on that October morning in 1943. Lieutenant Commander James Harrigan stood on the pier, watching as technicians made final adjustments to the USS Eldridge, a cannon-class destroyer escort that had become the subject of the Navy's most classified experiment. The ship sat low in the water, its gray hull gleaming with a fresh coat of paint that concealed modifications no ordinary vessel would ever require. Dr. Franklin Moss emerged from below deck, his white laboratory coat stained with oil and copper residue. He carried a clipboard thick with equations that would have bewildered even the most accomplished physicists at Princeton. Behind him, two naval engineers hauled a generator housing the size of a steamer trunk, their faces red with exertion. "The electromagnetic field generators are calibrated," Moss announced, pushing his wire-rimmed glasses up the bridge of his nose. "We're ready for the final test." Harrigan felt his stomach tighten. He had overseen 3 previous trials, each more unsettling than the last. During the first test, compasses within a mile radius had spun wildly. During the second, seagulls had fallen from the sky, disoriented and shrieking. The third test had been aborted when Seaman Rodriguez began bleeding from his nose and ears, claiming he could hear colors and see sounds. "What about the crew?" Harrigan asked, watching as sailors moved about the deck with the nervous energy of men who knew they were part of something unprecedented. "They've been briefed as much as security protocols allow," Moss replied, his voice carrying the detached tone of a man who lived more comfortably with theories than with people. "The Faraday cage modifications should protect them from the worst of the electromagnetic interference." Should. Harrigan hated that word. In his 20 years of naval service, he had learned that should was the gap where disaster lived. 37 men had volunteered for the crew, though volunteer was a generous term when applied to sailors following orders in wartime. Chief Petty Officer Michael O'Brien, a Boston Irishman with hands like anvils and a voice that could cut through a hurricane, had been aboard the Eldridge since her commissioning. He stood now at the helm, running through pre-departure checks with the methodical precision that had made him invaluable. Below deck, in the converted storage hold that now housed the experimental equipment, Ensign David Chen monitored an array of instruments that looked more like something from a science fiction pulp magazine than standard naval equipment. Copper coils wound around the ship's interior in complex geometrical patterns. Tesla coils hummed with barely contained energy. Banks of capacitors, each the size of a car battery, sat ready to discharge on command. The theory, as Moss had explained it during the initial briefing, was elegant in its ambition. By generating a massive electromagnetic field around the ship, they could bend light and radar waves around the vessel, rendering it invisible to enemy detection. The implications for the war effort were staggering. A fleet of invisible ships could turn the tide against the Nazi U-boats that prowled the Atlantic. What Moss had not fully explained, what perhaps he himself did not fully understand, was what else such a field might affect. Time and space, Einstein had shown, were not the rigid constructs humanity had long assumed. They were flexible, malleable, subject to distortion by sufficient energy. At precisely 0900 hours, Admiral Thornton arrived with an entourage of brass and civilians, whose credentials Harrigan was not cleared to verify. They took positions on the adjacent pier, binoculars raised, notebooks ready. A photographer from Naval Intelligence set up his equipment, though Harrigan suspected the resulting images would never see the light of day. "All hands, prepare for generator activation," Harrigan announced over the ship's intercom. His voice echoed across the deck and through the narrow corridors below. O'Brien secured the helm and checked that every man was at his station. In the engine room, the regular turbines thrummed their familiar rhythm, but it was the auxiliary generators, Moss's modifications, that began to emit an entirely different sound. It started as a low hum, barely perceptible, felt more in the bones than heard by the ears. Chen watched his instruments as power flowed through the coils. Needles climbed across gauge faces. The air itself seemed to thicken, taking on a quality like the moment before a lightning strike. He could taste copper on his tongue, could feel his fillings vibrating in his teeth. "Field strength at 30%, Chen reported, his voice tight. 40%, 50%. The hum became a whine. The water around the Eldridge's hull began to churn, though the ship's propellers were not engaged. A greenish phosphorescence appeared along the waterline, spreading upward along the hull like luminescent ivy. 70%, Chen called out. "Sir, I'm seeing fluctuations in the temporal resonance readings. This is outside normal parameters." On the pier, Dr. Moss leaned forward, his eyes bright with the fervor of a man watching his theories transform into reality. Magnificent, he breathed. 80%. Sir, the magnetic variance is... Chen's words were drowned out by a sound like 1,000 violins being played backwards. The green glow enveloped the entire ship now, pulsing with a rhythm that matched no human heartbeat. O'Brien gripped the helm as the deck beneath his feet began to vibrate. Through the bridge windows he could see the pier, the Admiral, Dr. Moss, but they were becoming indistinct, as if he were viewing them through water. 90%, Chen shouted, struggling to be heard over the cacophony of sound and electromagnetic noise. Field coherence is... Jesus Christ! The USS Eldridge vanished. One moment it was there, a solid mass of steel and electronics and 37 terrified men. The next moment the water of the shipyard slapped together where the hull had been, sending up a spray that caught the morning light in a perfect rainbow. On the pier, Admiral Thornton dropped his binoculars. Dr. Moss stood frozen, his mouth working soundlessly. The photographer's camera fell from nerveless fingers and shattered on the concrete. For 17 seconds, later confirmed by multiple synchronized watches, the Eldridge simply did not exist in any observable form. Naval personnel on nearby vessels reported a shimmer in the air, like heat rising from summer asphalt. Some claimed to hear voices, distant and distorted, speaking words in no recognizable language. Then, with a thunderclap that shattered windows in the shipyard's administrative building, the Eldridge returned. But it did not return unchanged. The ship materialized 30 feet from its original position, listing heavily to port. Smoke poured from vents and hatches. The green phosphorescence had faded, replaced by scorch marks that ran along the hull in patterns that seemed to follow the paths of the electromagnetic coils below. Medical teams, go, go! Harrigan was already running down the pier before anyone else could react. Behind him, sailors scrambled toward the gangway with stretchers and medical kits. The first man out of the ship was Seaman Rodriguez, the same sailor who had suffered during the earlier tests. He staggered onto the deck, his eyes wild, his uniform smoking. We were somewhere else, he gasped before collapsing. Inside the ship, the rescue teams found scenes that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. 3 sailors were embedded in the steel bulkheads, their bodies partially fused with the metal at a molecular level. They were still alive, screaming in agony that no morphine could touch. 2 men had vanished entirely, their uniforms found neatly folded on the deck where they had been standing. Ensign Chen was discovered in the equipment hold, aged 40 years in 17 seconds. His hair was white, his face lined with wrinkles, his hands gnarled with arthritis. He looked up at his rescuers with rheumy eyes and whispered, "We broke something. We broke the world." O'Brien was on the bridge, unconscious but physically intact. When he woke 3 days later in the naval hospital, he could not explain the severe radiation burns on his hands, or why his watch showed a date 3 months in the future. Of the 37 men who had been aboard the Eldridge, 5 were dead within a week. 8 were permanently institutionalized. The rest were scattered to different posts across the country, ordered never to speak of what had happened, their medical records sealed under classifications that would outlast the war itself. The ship was towed to a remote dry dock where teams of scientists descended upon it like crows on a battlefield. They documented everything: the scorch patterns, the impossible metallurgical anomalies, the instruments that had stopped working according to any known laws of physics. One researcher discovered that his compass, when brought within 10 feet of the Eldridge, pointed neither north nor south but straight down, as if magnetized by the center of the Earth itself, or by something beyond it. Dr. Moss disappeared 2 weeks after the experiment. His laboratory was found ransacked, his notes gone. Some said he had fled to South America. Others whispered that he had been taken by government agents to work on even more secret projects. A few claimed they had seen him walking the streets of Philadelphia at night, talking to himself in equations, drawing diagrams in the air with trembling fingers. The official report classified the entire incident as equipment failure, uncontrolled electromagnetic discharge. The Eldridge was repaired, recommissioned, and sent to the Mediterranean theater, where it served without incident for the remainder of the war. Its crew were new men who knew nothing of what the ship had experienced, who slept peacefully in bunks where others had screamed themselves hoarse with temporal displacement psychosis. But Harrigan knew. He had watched the ship vanish and return. He had seen men pull themselves out of solid steel. He had held Ensign Chen's ancient hand and felt the papery skin of a man who had lived decades in seconds. In his office at night, Harrigan often pulled out the classified files and stared at the photographs taken that October morning. In some of them, if you looked very carefully at the moment just before the Eldridge vanished, you could see something in the background, a distortion in the fabric of reality itself, a crack in the world through which impossible light bled through. The Navy buried the Philadelphia experiment under layers of secrecy and denial. The Eldridge served out its commission and was eventually sold for scrap. The survivors took their secrets to their graves, most of them dying young from cancers that ate through their bodies like temporal radiation. But the ship, the actual USS Eldridge, with its modified coils and its scorch-marked hull, did not end its story in a scrapyard. Because what Harrigan and the others did not know, what they could not have known, was that the experiment had not simply failed. It had succeeded far beyond its intended parameters. The Eldridge had not just become invisible, it had slipped sideways in time, creating a wound in causality that would not heal. And wounds, if left untreated, tend to open again. 42 years later, in the cold waters off the coast of Maine, a fishing trawler named the Mary Catherine would haul up something in its nets that should not exist. The captain, a grizzled veteran of 30 years on the Atlantic, would find himself staring at a ship's bell, corroded but still legible, bearing the name USS Eldridge and a commissioning date of 1943. But that bell had been removed from the scrapped Eldridge in 1946 and melted down with the rest of the ship's brass. Records confirmed it. Multiple witnesses had watched it happen. Yet here it was, dripping seawater and kelp, impossibly whole. The captain reported the find to the Coast Guard, who reported it to the Navy, who sent it through channels that grew increasingly classified until it landed on the desk of Dr. Sarah Chen, granddaughter of the ensign who had aged 40 years in 17 seconds. She had spent her entire career studying her grandfather's fragmented journals, trying to understand what had happened aboard that ship. Now she held the bell in her hands and felt it vibrate with a frequency that matched no known electromagnetic signature. When she ran her fingers over the engraving, she felt warmth, as if the metal remembered fire. "It's happening again," she whispered to the empty laboratory. "Whatever they did, wherever they sent it, the Eldridge is trying to come home. Doctor." Sarah Chen stood in the Naval Research Laboratory's Anomalous Materials Division, a department so classified it existed in no official budget, occupying a subterranean level beneath the Pentagon that did not appear on any building schematic. The bell sat on an examination table under full-spectrum lighting, its bronze surface pitted with corrosion that defied standard metallurgical aging patterns. Carbon dating placed it simultaneously at 42 years old and at several thousand years old, depending on which section of the metal was sampled. "This is impossible," said Dr. Marcus Webb, the laboratory's chief metallurgist. He had been analyzing the bell for 3 days straight, surviving on coffee and increasingly desperate attempts to make the data conform to known physics. The crystalline structure of the bronze has been altered at the quantum level. The atoms are entangled with nothing, with spaces where matter should be but isn't. Sarah knew exactly what that meant, though she had hoped never to encounter proof of her grandfather's theories. David Chen had spent the last 30 years of his life, artificially aged into an elderly man before his 40th birthday, developing mathematical models to explain what had happened aboard the Eldridge. He had died when Sarah was 12, but not before passing his research to her. Boxes of notebooks filled with equations that danced at the edge of comprehensibility, describing a universe with more dimensions than human senses could perceive. "It's resonating with another time frame," Sarah said quietly. She placed a quantum detector next to the bell, watching as the readouts spiked and fluctuated. The Eldridge didn't just travel through space when it vanished. It slipped through time itself, creating a pocket dimension, a bubble in space-time. And now that bubble is collapsing. Webb stared at her. "You're saying the ship still exists somewhere, after all these years?" "Not somewhere, somewhen." Sarah pulled up a holographic display, showing a three-dimensional temporal map based on her grandfather's equations. The electromagnetic field they generated in 1943 was supposed to bend light around the ship. Instead, it bent time. The Eldridge exists in a state of quantum superposition. It's both destroyed and intact, both here and not here. The bell is the first piece that's fallen through the cracks. As if responding to her words, the bell suddenly rang. No one had touched it. No vibration had disturbed the table. But the bell swung once, twice, producing a tone that seemed to bypass the ears entirely and resonate directly in the listeners' skulls. Sarah felt her vision blur. For just a moment she was standing on the deck of a ship, feeling it pitch beneath her feet, hearing men shouting in terror. Then she was back in the laboratory, gasping. "Did you—" Webb began, but he was interrupted by alarms screaming throughout the facility. Sarah sprinted to the main monitoring station where Lieutenant Commander Jackson was already pulling up satellite feeds. "We've got a massive electromagnetic anomaly forming off the coast of Maine," he reported, his voice tight with controlled panic. "Same coordinates where the fishing boat found the bell." The satellite imagery showed a disturbance in the ocean that defied explanation. The water was rotating in a perfect spiral 300 feet across, but it was rotating backwards, counter to every natural law of fluid dynamics. Lightning arced from the clear sky to strike the center of the spiral, but the lightning was green, the same phosphorescent green that witnesses had reported in 1943. "Get me a helicopter," Sarah ordered, "and a full quantum measurement array. If I'm right, we're about to witness the return of a ship that's been lost in time for 42 years. 3 hours later, Sarah was aboard a Coast Guard cutter, racing toward the anomaly. The water around them had taken on an oily quality, reflecting light at wrong angles. Her instruments, hastily assembled from equipment designed to detect gravitational waves and quantum fluctuations, were redlining. "The temporal gradient is increasing," she shouted over the roar of wind that had suddenly picked up despite the clear weather. "We're approaching a bubble of space-time where the normal flow of causality has been disrupted." The captain, a woman named Torres who had seen 3 tours in the Middle East and considered herself unshakable, gripped the railing with white knuckles. "Dr. Chen, the water ahead. It's not right." Sarah looked up from her instruments and felt her breath catch. The spiral had grown to nearly half a mile across, and at its center, the ocean had turned to mirror. Not reflecting the sky but showing something else entirely. A night sky with stars in wrong positions, a moon that was too large and tinted amber, and beneath it all, a ship. The USS Eldridge rose from the impossible mirror like a whale breaching, water streaming from its hull in defiance of gravity. But this was not the restored, repainted Eldridge that had served in the Mediterranean. This was the ship exactly as it had been the moment it vanished in 1943, scorched, smoking, listing to port, its deck lights still burning with that sickly green glow. "All stop," Torres commanded. The cutter's engines ground to a halt, leaving them bobbing in water that now felt viscous, resistant to movement. Through binoculars, Sarah could see figures on the Eldridge's deck. Men in 1940s naval uniforms moving with jerky, uncertain motions like old film footage. One of them, a burly man with Chief Petty Officer's insignia, stood at the railing staring directly at the Coast Guard cutter with an expression of absolute confusion. "They're still there," Sarah whispered. 42 years. And for them, no time has passed at all. She grabbed the radio. "USS Eldridge, this is Dr. Sarah Chen of the United States Naval Research Laboratory. Can you hear me?" Static crashed over the channel, mixed with sounds that might have been voices or might have been the howling of winds from dimensions that had no proper place in human experience. Then, through the noise, a response. "This is Chief Petty Officer Michael O'Brien, USS Eldridge. Where the hell are we? What happened to the shipyard?" Sarah's hands trembled on the radio. O'Brien had been one of the survivors of the original experiment, institutionalized after claiming he could remember the future. He had died in 1958, mad and alone in a veterans' hospital. Yet here he was, alive, young, terrified. "Chief O'Brien, you need to listen carefully. The date is October 15th, 1985. Your ship has been caught in a temporal displacement field. You've traveled 42 years into the future." The radio silence that followed stretched for nearly a minute. When O'Brien's voice returned, it was hollow with shock. "That's impossible. We just ran the test. Harrigan activated the generators and then—" His voice broke. "The men. Jesus Christ, what happened to my men?" Sarah closed her eyes, remembering the classified reports she had read. The sailors fused with bulkheads, the ones who had aged or vanished, the nightmares that had driven survivors to suicide. "Chief, I need you to keep your crew calm. We're going to bring you in, but the temporal field around your ship is unstable. Any sudden movements could—" The Eldridge lurched sideways, phasing partially out of existence. Through the sections of hull that turned translucent, Sarah could see the ghosts of other ships, other times, a Spanish galleon, a nuclear submarine, vessels that had never been built superimposed over the destroyer escort in a nauseating palimpsest of possibility. Her instruments screamed warnings. The bubble is collapsing faster than predicted, she told Torres. If the Eldridge fully solidifies in our timeline while the field is still active, it could create a causality paradox that, in English, Doctor, it could tear a hole in space-time that would make the original experiment look like a firecracker. Torres grabbed the radio to the mainland. This is Coast Guard Cutter Vigilant. We need immediate evacuation of all coastal populations within 50 miles of these coordinates. This is not a drill. But Sarah was no longer listening to the evacuation orders. She was watching the Eldridge, watching as sailors emerged from below deck, watching as they saw the modern Coast Guard vessel, the helicopters that had begun to circle overhead, the world that had aged 4 decades while they experienced only moments. One sailor, young and fresh-faced, stumbled to the railing and vomited over the side. The vomit hit the water and instantly aged, becoming a skeleton of a fish that had died years ago, then dust that scattered on the impossible wind. The temporal gradient is affecting organic matter more severely than inorganic, Sarah noted, her scientific training attempting to impose order on the chaos. Anyone who tries to leave the Eldridge while it's phasing will experience catastrophic temporal shear. She watched as Chief O'Brien organized his men, his voice carrying across the water with that Boston accent intact, unchanged by the years he had skipped. He was doing what petty officers did best, keeping his sailors alive through force of will and competent profanity. But then Sarah saw something that made her blood freeze. On the bridge of the Eldridge, standing at the observation window, was Ensign David Chen, her grandfather. Not the aged, broken man she remembered from her childhood, but young and whole and terrified. "Grandfather," she whispered, though he could not possibly hear her across the water and decades. As if responding to her voice, David Chen turned. For a moment, their eyes met across the impossible gulf of time. His mouth moved, forming words she could not hear but could somehow understand. "I'm sorry. We didn't know. We couldn't have known." The Eldridge shuddered again, and this time pieces of it began to break away, not physically falling apart, but separating across temporal boundaries. A lifeboat that had been lashed to the deck in 1943 suddenly existed in 1985, crashing into the ocean as a rusted hulk that disintegrated on impact. A section of railing vanished from the present and reappeared as a ghost image of itself 42 years ago, visible only as a shimmer in the air. "We're losing containment," Sarah shouted. The ship is fragmenting across multiple time frames simultaneously. On the Eldridge, O'Brien had reached the same conclusion. She could see him making the impossible decision that all good officers must sometimes make, the decision to save what he could, even if he couldn't save everything. "Abandon ship," his voice carried clearly across the water now, as if the barriers between time frames were thinning. "All hands, emergency evacuation procedures." But there was nowhere for the men to go. The lifeboats existed in a state of quantum uncertainty, simultaneously there and not there. The water itself had become a temporal minefield where a man might age to death in the space between one stroke and the next. Sarah looked at her instruments, then at the Eldridge, then at her grandfather standing helplessly on the bridge. She had spent her entire career studying this moment, preparing for this possibility. She knew what had to be done, even if the cost was incalculable. "Captain Torres," she said quietly, "I need you to get your ship out of here right now. Move beyond the temporal gradient boundary and don't look back." Torres understood immediately what Sarah was planning. "Doctor, if you go aboard that ship, I'm the only one who can stabilize the field. My grandfather's equations, his research, I've spent 20 years learning how to reverse what they did in 1943, but I can only do it from inside the bubble, from aboard the Eldridge itself. You'll be trapped with them, lost in time." Sarah smiled, though there was no humor in it. "I was always going to be trapped with them, Captain. From the moment I inherited my grandfather's research, this was the only possible ending to my story." She didn't wait for Torres to argue. She grabbed the portable quantum stabilizer, a device that existed only in prototype form, built from her grandfather's theoretical designs, and dove into the water. The ocean embraced her like a living thing. She felt herself stretched across seconds, compressed across hours. She was drowning and she was breathing. She was young and she was old. She was born and she was dying, all in the space between one heartbeat and the next. Then strong hands pulled her from the water onto the deck of the USS Eldridge, and she was coughing up seawater that tasted of brass and ozone. and Chief Petty Officer Michael O'Brien was staring down at her with an expression that mixed concern with complete bafflement. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded. Sarah pushed herself to her feet, clutching the stabilizer. Behind her, the Coast Guard cutter was racing away, already beginning to fade as the Eldridge pulled her deeper into its temporal displacement field. "I'm Dr. Sarah Chen," she said, meeting O'Brien's eyes, "and I'm here to save your ship." She looked past him to the bridge, where her grandfather stood frozen in shock, staring at her with the dawning recognition that sometimes, impossibly, the universe arranged itself in patterns that defied all rational explanation. "I'm also," Sarah continued, her voice barely above a whisper, "your granddaughter, Ensign Chen, and I need you to trust me, because we have about 30 minutes before this ship tears itself apart and takes a significant portion of the eastern seaboard with it." The deck beneath their feet shuddered. Somewhere in the distance, Sarah could hear the sound of time itself beginning to scream. The USS Eldridge existed in a state that no human mind was designed to comprehend. Sarah stood on the deck, her quantum stabilizer clutched in both hands, watching as past and future bled into each other like watercolors in the rain. Through the ship's hull, she could see ghostly impressions of its entire history playing out simultaneously. The workers in the Philadelphia shipyard welding its plates together, the sailors manning battle stations in the Mediterranean, the cutting torches that had eventually reduced it to scrap, all happening at once in a kaleidoscope of overlapping moments. Chief O'Brien grabbed her arm, his grip solid and real in a world that was becoming increasingly neither. "You said you can save the ship. How?" Sarah looked at the 37 men gathered on the deck, these sailors who had volunteered for an experiment they couldn't possibly understand, who now found themselves unstuck in time, simultaneously living and dying across multiple decades. Some of them were starting to flicker, their bodies uncertain about which time frame they belonged to. Seaman Rodriguez clutched his head, blood trickling from his nose as temporal radiation burned through his synapses. "The electromagnetic field they generated in 1943 didn't just make you invisible," Sarah explained, her voice cutting through the eerie whine of warped spacetime. "It created a pocket dimension, a bubble where normal causality doesn't apply. You've been trapped in that bubble for 42 years, experiencing only moments while the world moved on without you. The bubble is collapsing now, trying to reconcile your existence with a timeline that already believes you're dead or insane, or scattered across a dozen mental institutions." David Chen descended from the bridge, his young face, so strange for Sarah to see without the wrinkles and white hair she remembered, set with determination. "I've been monitoring the field generators," he said. "They're still active, still pulling power from somewhere that isn't the ship's engines. It's as if they're feeding on the temporal differential itself." Sarah nodded. Her grandfather had theorized this in his later writings, though he'd never been certain. The generators had achieved a kind of perpetual motion by harvesting energy from the friction between different time frames. Elegant, impossible, and catastrophically dangerous. "We need to reverse the field polarity," Sarah said, opening the stabilizer and beginning to connect leads to the ship's electrical system. "But we can't just shut it down. The sudden collapse would be like releasing a compressed spring. The temporal energy would discharge all at once, potentially creating a cascade that could destabilize causality for hundreds of miles." "So what do we do?" O'Brien demanded. Around them, the water had begun to spiral upward in defiance of gravity, forming waterspouts that reached toward a sky that kept flickering between day and night. 1943 and 1985, sunshine and stars. "We create an anchor point," Sarah said, her hands moving quickly to reconfigure the stabilizer's controls. "A fixed moment in space-time that the ship can collapse back into, but it requires a massive energy discharge, more than the generators alone can provide. It requires—" She trailed off, looking at the assembled crew. David Chen understood first. He had always been brilliant, even before the experiment had artificially aged his mind. "It requires a biological catalyst, a human consciousness to serve as a reference point for causality." "No," Sarah said sharply, "not just any consciousness. It requires someone who exists in both time frames simultaneously, someone who has a causal connection to both 1943 and 1985. She met her grandfather's eyes, and in that moment he understood. She was his granddaughter, carrying his DNA forward through time. She existed because of him, yet she was here from a future he would never naturally live to see. She was the paradox made flesh, the living bridge between two moments that should never intersect. You're going to use yourself as the anchor, David Chen said quietly. It's the only way. My quantum signature spans both time frames. If I can interface with the field generators and synchronize my neural patterns with the electromagnetic field, I can provide a stable reference point for the collapse. The ship and everyone aboard will be pulled forward to 1985, fully integrated into the timeline. No more phasing, no more displacement. And you? O'Brien asked, though he clearly already knew the answer. I'll become part of the field itself, neither here nor there, neither then nor now, dispersed across the moments between moments. Sarah smiled, though her hands were shaking as she continued her preparations. There are worse fates than becoming part of the fabric of space-time. Unacceptable, David Chen said firmly. He grabbed Sarah's shoulders, this young man who would one day be her grandfather confronting this woman who carried his genetic legacy forward, through impossible circumstances. There has to be another way. There isn't. I've run the calculations 1,000 times, Ensign. I've spent my entire life preparing for this moment even before I knew what this moment would be. The math is absolute. The Eldridge comes home, or it tears reality apart. Those are the only options. And for the Eldridge to come home, someone has to pay the price. Alarms began to shriek throughout the ship. The temporal field was becoming increasingly unstable, reality itself beginning to fray at the edges. Through the translucent sections of hull, Sarah could see entire neighborhoods of coastal Maine flickering in and out of existence as the causality cascade began to spread. She didn't have time for arguments or alternatives. She grabbed the leads from the stabilizer and ran toward the converted storage hold, where the electromagnetic generators still hummed with stolen time. O'Brien and David Chen followed, along with several other sailors who moved through the corridors, with the practiced efficiency of men who knew their ship even when their ship no longer knew itself. The equipment hold was a nightmare of sparking cables and reality distortions. One corner of the room existed 30 years in the past, showing fresh paint and orderly equipment. Another corner had aged centuries, the walls corroded and crumbling. In the center, the generators spun in their housings, surrounded by Tesla coils that arced with green lightning. Sarah began connecting her stabilizer to the generator control panels, integrating modern quantum computing with 1940s electrical engineering in a hybrid system that should have been impossible. Her fingers flew across both physical switches and holographic interfaces, building a bridge between technologies separated by 4 decades of innovation. I need 5 minutes to calibrate the field resonance, she said, not looking up from her work. O'Brien, I need you to keep the ship stable. Chen, monitor the temporal gradient and tell me if we start to fragment further. But David Chen wasn't moving to follow orders. He was staring at the equations Sarah had scrawled on a notepad, recognizing them as extensions of the theoretical work he had only begun to explore. These calculations, I wrote something similar. Well, right. Jesus, the tenses don't even work anymore. You'll spend the rest of your life developing this theory, Sarah said softly, finally meeting his eyes. You'll age 40 years in the 17 seconds of the first test, but your mind will remain sharp. You'll dedicate yourself to understanding what happened here, to making sure this never happens to anyone else, and you'll pass your research to your granddaughter, who will use it to save you. A paradox, David Chen breathed. You're creating a closed causal loop. You can only save us because I'll spend decades developing the theory, but I'll only develop the theory because you came back to save us. The universe has a sense of irony, Sarah agreed. Now please monitor the temporal gradient. I need to know when we hit the critical threshold. The ship lurched again, and this time, they heard screams from the deck above. Sarah pushed down the fear. She couldn't afford it. Not now. Not with the fate of the Eldridge and potentially the entire eastern seaboard hanging on her ability to complete the calibration. Her hands moved across the controls, fine-tuning the electromagnetic frequencies, synchronizing the quantum stabilizer's outputs with the generator's inputs. She could feel the field resonating through her body, her atoms beginning to vibrate in harmony with the impossible energies surrounding the ship. Temporal gradient reaching critical point, David Chen reported, his voice tight. We're starting to fragment faster. I'm reading causality violations in 16 separate sections of the ship. Almost there, Sarah muttered, making minute adjustments. The mathematics were beautiful in their elegance. Her grandfather's theories combined with 40 years of quantum research to create a solution that existed in perfect balance between the possible and the impossible. O'Brien's voice crackled over the intercom. Doc, Whatever you're going to do it fast. Half my men are flickering like bad light bulbs, and I can see things in the water that I really hope are hallucinations. Sarah made one final adjustment and stepped back. It's ready. The field is configured to collapse on my neural signature. When I connect, the generators will begin reversing polarity, pulling the temporal bubble closed. The ship will be dragged forward to the present moment, October 15, 1985, and fully integrated into the timeline. And you'll be... David Chen couldn't finish the sentence. Everywhere and nowhere, every moment between October 28, 1943 and October 15, 1985 simultaneously. I'll exist as a quantum probability spread across 42 years. Not dead, not alive, just diffused. She picked up the neural interface leads, custom-built devices that would connect directly to her cerebral cortex, allowing the generators to use her brainwave patterns as a template for the collapse. Her hands shook as she positioned them against her temples. "Wait," David Chen said. He pulled a small notebook from his pocket, the beginning of the journals that Sarah had inherited, that had guided her entire career. He scribbled something quickly and pressed it into her hands. "When you're dispersed across time, when you exist in all those moments simultaneously, remember this. Remember that you're not alone. You'll be there, in every moment, experiencing every second of those 42 years. And I'll be there too, living through them, working toward this moment. We'll be connected across time itself." Sarah looked at what he'd written. It was an equation, elegant and simple, describing the quantum entanglement between related consciousnesses across temporal boundaries. "The Chen constant," she whispered. "You'll publish this in 1967. It will become the foundation for all temporal mechanics research." "I'm publishing it now," David Chen said. "For you." On the deck above, O'Brien was shouting orders as the temporal field reached critical instability. Sections of the ship were beginning to exist in multiple time frames simultaneously, creating a horrific patchwork where 1943 and 1985 collided in impossible configurations. Sarah positioned the neural interface leads, took a deep breath, and looked at her grandfather one last time. "Take care of them," she said. "All of them. Help them adjust to a world that's aged 40 years without them. And when you have children, and when they have children, tell them. Tell them that some sacrifices echo across time itself." "I will," David Chen promised. "I'll tell her about the brave scientist who saved a ship full of sailors. I'll tell her every day." Sarah closed her eyes and activated the neural interface. The connection was instantaneous and overwhelming. Her consciousness exploded outward, touching every moment the Eldridge had experienced. Every second of its existence from the moment the first plates were laid in the Philadelphia shipyard to this impossible instant suspended between time frames. She felt the ship's birth, its life, its death in the scrapyard, and its impossible resurrection all at once. The generators screamed as they reversed polarity, the green phosphorescence turning blue, then white, then a color that had no name in any human language. The temporal bubble began to collapse, pulling the Eldridge forward through time like a ship riding a wave. On the deck, the sailors felt reality solidify around them. The flickering stopped. The water returned to normal physics, falling from the sky where it had been suspended in impossible spirals. The sky locked into a single state. October 15, 1985. Early afternoon with clouds gathering in the east. In the equipment hold, David Chen watched as Sarah Chen, his granddaughter, his salvation, his tragedy, began to phase out of existence. But she wasn't disappearing the way the ship had disappeared. She was spreading, dispersing, her form becoming translucent, her features blurring as she existed simultaneously in thousands of moments across 42 years. For just an instant, David Chen could see her everywhere, standing in the Philadelphia shipyard in 1943, watching the ship's construction, present in the hospital where he would spend decades recovering from his artificial aging, there in the classroom where she would first learn physics, present at her own birth, at her grandfather's funeral, at 1,000 pivotal moments, experiencing all of them at once. Then she was gone, dissolved into the fabric of space-time itself, her consciousness dispersed across decades like light through a prism. The USS Eldridge settled fully into October 15, 1985, as solid and real as any ship had ever been. The generators shut down with a final wheeze, their impossible energy finally expended. The green glow faded completely, leaving only scorch marks and the lingering smell of ozone. On the deck, Chief Petty Officer Michael O'Brien looked around at his crew, all 37 men accounted for, all of them whole and healthy, and existing firmly in one time frame. Then he looked at the Coast Guard cutter racing back toward them, at the helicopters circling overhead at a world that had moved on 40 years without them. "Well, lads," he said, his Boston accent thick with emotion, "welcome to the future. Let's try not to break it again." The debriefing took 3 months. The 37 sailors of the USS Eldridge were sequestered at a secure facility, while teams of scientists, military officials, and government agents tried to understand what had happened. They were men from 1943 living in 1985, soldiers who had volunteered to fight Hitler and now found themselves in a world where that war had been won and lost 4 decades ago. Some adapted better than others. Chief O'Brien became a consultant for the Naval Research Laboratory's Anomalous Materials Division, his first-hand experience with temporal displacement proving invaluable. Seaman Rodriguez, who had suffered so much during the original tests, found peace working as a lighthouse keeper in Maine, where the only thing he needed to track was the eternal rhythm of the tides. Ensign David Chen requested and received a medical discharge. The Navy was happy to grant it. What else could they do with a man who had been artificially aged 40 years but whose military records showed him as still young? He moved to a small house in Philadelphia, where he spent his remaining years documenting everything he remembered about the Eldridge, about the experiment, and most of all, about the remarkable woman who had saved them all. He married in 1988, had a daughter in 1990, and when that daughter had a child of her own in 2015, David Chen held his granddaughter and whispered, "Your name is Sarah, and you're going to be brilliant." The closed causal loop completed itself with perfect symmetry. In the years that followed, there were reports. Sailors stationed in the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard would sometimes catch glimpses of a woman in the shadows, watching them work with an expression of infinite sadness. She would appear for just a moment, then vanish before anyone could approach her. Researchers working late in the Anomalous Materials Division would feel a presence looking over their shoulders, guiding their calculations, correcting their mistakes with invisible hands. When they checked their work the next morning, they would find errors they had somehow avoided making, as if someone had been watching out for them. On October 28th of every year without fail, naval personnel across the world would report the same phenomenon: the smell of ozone and brass, a flash of green light on the horizon, and the distant sound of a ship's bell ringing across impossible distances. Dr. Marcus Webb, who had analyzed the bell found by the fishing trawler, spent his career studying these reports. He developed a theory that consciousness, when dispersed across temporal boundaries, didn't simply cease to exist. Instead, it remained aware, experiencing every moment of its dispersed timeline simultaneously. Sarah Chen existed in every second between October 28, 1943 and October 15, 1985, aware and watching and unable to interact with the world except in the smallest, most subtle ways. "She's not gone," Webb wrote in his final paper before retirement. "She's everywhere. Every moment of those 42 years contains her presence. She is the ghost in the temporal machine, the observer collapsed across countless quantum states, experiencing everything and nothing forever." On October 15, 2027, exactly 42 years after the Eldridge's return, the Naval Research Laboratory organized a quiet ceremony at the coordinates where the ship had reappeared. The surviving sailors were long dead by then. Chief O'Brien had passed in 2003, the last of them, but their descendants attended, along with scientists and military officials who had devoted their careers to understanding the Philadelphia experiment. David Chen's granddaughter, the younger Sarah Chen, named for the woman she would never meet but whose destiny she carried in her genes, stood at the railing of a Coast Guard cutter and scattered ashes into the water. They had come from her grandfather's journals, burned in accordance with his final wishes, so that some small part of his consciousness could join hers in the spaces between moments. As the ashes touched the water, something impossible happened. The ocean glowed green for just an instant. The smell of ozone filled the air, and every person present heard it, the crystal-clear sound of a ship's bell ringing, not with mourning, but with something that sounded almost like joy. Young Sarah Chen smiled through her tears. She understood in that moment what her grandfather had spent his life trying to explain. Time was not a line, but a tapestry, and somewhere in the weave of that tapestry, the two Sarah Chens existed together, the elder scattered across decades, the younger carrying her legacy forward into the future. "Thank you," Young Sarah whispered to the wind and the water and the spaces between seconds. Thank you for saving them. Thank you for all of it. The green glow faded. The bell fell silent. But in the years that followed, researchers at the Naval Laboratory would swear that their most difficult problems seemed to solve themselves, that their most complex calculations would resolve with unusual elegance, that sometimes, just sometimes, they could feel someone watching over their work with infinite patience and infinite care. The USS Eldridge had returned home, but Sarah Chen, the woman who had made that return possible, remained scattered across time itself, not dead, not gone, but transformed into something beyond human understanding. She was the price paid for the sailor's salvation, the anchor that held the Eldridge fast to reality, the ghost in the quantum machine who would watch over naval research for as long as time itself continued to flow. And on certain nights when the stars aligned just right and the veil between moments grew thin, those with the right instruments could detect her presence, a consciousness dispersed across decades, experiencing every second of 42 years simultaneously, forever watching, forever waiting, forever present in the endless space between then and now. The Philadelphia experiment had ended not with answers, but with a question that would echo through generations. What happens to a person who becomes time itself? Dr. Sarah Chen, scattered across the decades, existing in every moment between 1943 and 1985, experiencing all of them at once in an eternal, infinite present, might have known the answer, but she could no longer speak in words that the merely chronological could understand.